Welcome to the Special Education Essentials for Parents and Families podcast with your host, David Tollner. In each episode, we'll have guests who are professionals in the special education and disability services industry who support children with special needs. The law is complex, and this podcast does not cover all situations, legal responsibilities, or variations in different circumstances. This podcast is for entertainment and informational purposes only, and nothing contained in this podcast should be construed as legal advice. The views expressed in this podcast may not be those of the host or the firm. We are not responsible for any losses, damages, or liabilities that may arise from the use of this podcast. This podcast is not intended to replace legal advice. You can find this show on all the major platforms including YouTube, LinkedIn, Facebook, Apple Podcast, Spotify, and on our website, TollnerLawOffices.com. Now, here's the host of Special Education Essentials for Parents and Families, David Tollner.
All right. Welcome, everyone, to another episode of Special Education Essentials. I am your host, David Tollner, and we have a very special guest today in Kristen Atkins, the head of school of Winston Preparatory School in San Rafael, and an expert in dyslexia and teaching students with dyslexia and learning disabilities. And if you've followed this show, you know I like to sort of relate my guest to the first three episodes when I gave a rundown of the 10 most important things you can do to prepare for an IEP. In this case, it's quite obvious. Kristen is really, from my experience, has the most experience and understanding of dyslexia of anyone I've ever met. We are here to talk about Winston School, so everybody understands that. But what I really want to get into with Kristen is dyslexia, and if your child has dyslexia and you're listening to this, how to prep for an IEP. Right, that's what this podcast is about, and how really to take the information and the data you have with your child into the IEP and have a more successful outcome. That's what this show is about, and why Kristen is here. So she's a very special guest for us and for any of you listening. All right, with that, Kristen, thank you so much for joining us today. Welcome to Special Education Connections.
Well, thank you. That was a lovely introduction. I thought it would be just helpful to give you a little bit about my background. I've been in this field for over 3 decades, and I stay in this field because I've always felt committed that if 20% of our kids have neurodiversity, you can't just disregard 20% of our children because many of them have incredible talents. As you know, there's a huge continuum. There can be students with mild dyslexia, and then I've met some students who have profound dyslexia, which sometimes we call it a double deficit. And the key thing to keep in mind is these are students who we see unexpected deficits in relation to some of their other cognitive abilities. Classically, as parents, you probably have discovered that, by first or second grade, you might notice some challenges with learning how to read. I think it might be helpful just to give you a brief little foray into sort of the concept of how reading is taught in the United States and some of the challenges, just to give you that little context. There have been reading wars for decades. And when you think about a reading war, it's, are we going to teach with more of a phonological approach, or are we going to teach with whole language? California has pretty much always fallen into the category of we are going to teach with whole language. Interestingly, in the year 2000, the National Institutes of Health came out with a national reading panel. And that was a lot of studies. They did a lot of research. And what they realized is that reading programs had inadequate phonemic awareness categories for students. Interestingly, if you're dyslexic, that's part of your challenge. You have phonological processing challenges. So if you're a student that has a dyslexic profile and you are in a school where they are not teaching phonemic awareness and phonological awareness, your deficit is going to become even more pronounced. I find it quite fascinating that that report came out in 2000. It is 2025, and we are still debating how to teach reading. And as parents, I'm sure that's really frustrating to you. I also would want to possibly recommend you listen to a podcast by Emily Hanford called Sold a Story. It's the whole concept of the publishing, how we, buy reading programs, how teachers are trained. I am in the category and have always been in the category that all children can learn how to read, even dyslexic students. But dyslexic students often need a different kind of approach. They need more time to develop these skills, and they need to have the right kind of instruction. Just again, to put on your hat, it's 2025. We have all of these programs. We have Wilson, we have Barton, we have Slingerland, we have Orton Gillingham. Why do we still have 65% of our students who are struggling to read in fourth grade? It just doesn't make sense to me. And I think the burden has fallen on families. You're expected to know the data. I just think that's really unfair for a family to be able to go in and say, I think there's a problem with my child and I don't know what's happening. And people might tell you, oh, don't worry about it, they'll catch up. Well, the data shows they won't catch up without a lot of intensive remediation. So another interesting aspect when you think about reading, the University of Oregon in 1998 came up with something called the Dynamic Indicators of Basic Early Literacy Skills. It's called the DIBELS. They intentionally developed these 1-minute reading assessments that any school could access, which would be able to determine, based on data, they've collected hundreds of thousands of pieces of information on kids reading kindergarten through grade 8, where you could see how your child fits into whether they need intensive remediation, whether they need, average remediation, or if they're at benchmark. I'm still fascinated that most schools are not using this. It is a free resource. So one of my suggestions as a parent would be ask your school district, are they using the DIBELS to monitor progress monitoring for basic skills like letter awareness, phonological awareness, oral reading fluency? You can as parents, you don't want to access this data to use for instructional purposes because it is used to collect resource, but it's a really simple thing. Schools can test in the fall, they test in the winter, they test in the spring. Because it's data-based, you can compare your child's scores, and then you can see if you're going to, if they're moving into reaching their benchmarks. Just to give you a simple data point, by the end of second grade, kids should be reading fluently about 100 words per minute at a second grade level. If you listen to that podcast, Sold a Story, kind of one of the things that happened in the COVID epidemic was parents were actually watching their kids at home read. And that was where some of them realized my child is just putting in words that don't make sense. They're making up things. And it was actually a moment for some families to go, uh-oh, something's really wrong here. And they weren't aware of that because their children were getting good grades in school. And the concept of reading fluency is critical for comprehension. And for dyslexic students, when they first start to learn how to read, they're spending so much time trying to figure out what the word actually is that they can't comprehend what they're reading. So their cognitive energy is invested in decoding the word instead of understanding what it means. And so we have to sort of flip that script and get them to be able to practice multiple times so they can become more fluent readers. So when they're reading, they can actually understand what they're reading. There's another sort of very basic benchmark of if you're not reading about 120 words a minute, you're not able to comprehend what you're reading. And so I know in my years of working in this field, that's always one of my goals, particularly for my high school students. I need to get them in that 120 to 150 range because then I know they're going to be able to go off to college. They'll be successful. They might need more time. They might need to use books on tape to supplement if they've got a lot of reading to do. But at least I know they're going to be able to be successful.
No, that's absolutely right. You said a lot that I want to respond to. First is California, where we are, and this is a national broadcast, but in California, we just started calling it dyslexia a few years ago, right? It was a specific learning disability in reading, and we refused as a state to even call it what it was.
Yes.
And along with calling it dyslexia, all the districts in California are required to put a modality together that works, right? That is science-based, and we see very little of that, even 5-6 years later. It's just been a huge struggle in this state to get districts to really focus on dyslexia and develop modalities that work, right? That's what we want, that drive progress in these kids. And so a lesson for the listeners that have a child with dyslexia, asking for the DIBELS as part of your IEP, do it every quarter. Track, collect that data,
Yes.
that progress is actually being made. And then a final point before we get into the methods that you use at Winston Prep is this notion that good grades mean anything, right?
Mhm.
You commented on it. So trust me, parents, if you're listening to this and your child is getting good grades in English, it doesn't mean they're not 3, 4, 5 years behind in reading. Grades are very subjective. They're used by school districts in many cases to pass kids along. And the accommodations provided for so many of these students that allow them to pass along and get a good grade, it doesn't mean that they're actually learning how to read,
Yes, and
right?
David, speaking to that is, and I can share, anecdotal information because again, in 3 decades, I can't tell you how many 8th or ninth grade students that I've sat down with that are gifted intellectually, excellent mathematicians. Their ability to communicate ideas is fabulous, and I'll put a passage in front of them and say, "Could you read this out loud?" And they start crying
Yeah.
because they can't, but and to me that's I was like, how did anyone not notice? And when you really think about it, if you don't ask someone to read out loud and you pay attention to the words on the page, you don't know the mistakes they're making. And one of the things I used to share, I've done a lot of work with adult literacy, and I thought I've seen teachers say, "Oh, don't worry, just look at the first letter and put in a word that makes sense." And I said, if you were in a nursing program, you can't look at the big E word and say encephalitis or electrocardiogram because those are two very different words.
Right.
And so
Right.
you can't just look at the first letter and put in a word that makes sense. And so, but I have seen that is a strategy that sometimes kids are taught. And you have to, recalibrate
Well,
that strategy. It doesn't work.
it doesn't work, and we tend to, or I've seen it 1,000 times. I'm sure you have as well. The districts are looking for ways to move kids along and drive progress a little bit, but also get them to understand the lesson. And so books on tape have become widespread, which is great on one hand, but it's not a substitute for learning how to read. And that is something we see consistently within school districts, even in liberal and progressive California. We're not going out of our way very often to teach kids with learning disabilities, and particularly dyslexia, how to read, and we're not doing it very well. We see them consistently dropping further and further behind, right? The gap grows between them and their peers. And
Yes.
we need that gap, right, to
Yes. And
shorten.
it
We
also
need to be
comes,
as
it's
small as
like it's the, that reference, the Matthew effect, the rich get richer and the poor
yeah,
get poorer. And in, if you look at conventional education, up until the end of third grade, you are learning how to read. But after third grade, the expectation is you are reading to learn.
right.
And so I've seen many times with families, and parents will say, well, I didn't know. And because no one after third grade was tracking any data on oral reading fluency, or if they're profoundly dyslexic, how are you supporting their phonological awareness development? And that's just rhyming. It's, onset rhyme, manipulating sounds, understanding that the word cat has 3 sounds. And we often think, oh, because you're older, you don't need that. But those are the foundations of reading. And no matter how old you are, if you don't have the foundational building blocks, reading can become a very difficult task. And the burden should not be on the family to understand all this data. One thing you can do, you can, look up charts. There's multiple versions of these, of the benchmark for oral reading fluency for kindergarten, first, second, third, all the way through 8th grade. One of the great things about the DIBELS is, because of all the research they've done at the University of Oregon, they can track how many words per minute are within the realm of possibility of improvement. And so if a school district sets a goal of, oh, well, you're going to be reading, 120 words a minute by the end of third grade, and you're at 50, statistically, you're probably not going to get there by the end of third grade, without like intensive remediation, which can mean, an hour, 2 hours every day with a highly trained professional. It can't be an aide. It needs to be someone who can be diagnostic, who can look at patterns of errors and then fill in more practice for those specific things.
And we see that an awful lot. Obviously,
Mhm.
third, fourth, fifth graders, 2, 3, 4 years behind in reading. And you don't have to, if you're a parent listening, you don't have to catch up in 1 year. And you're not going to catch up in 1 year. It's just not going to happen. But what you can do is, you're approaching your district after getting, hopefully, some of the information you need from this podcast and other sources. You can set a path forward, and we do this often in my practice. Is we set a path forward. We look at how many. Listen, if I've got a second grader, I'm looking to close that gap significantly, maybe by fifth grade. Or if
Mhm.
I've got a sixth grader that's way behind, I'm taking that entire 3 years of middle school and I'm mapping out a plan for with my IEP goals to close that gap by the end of 8th grade.
Mhm.
I may not get to a completely closed gap between my client and his or her peers, but I'm getting as close as I can. And that's how you're talking to the district in these IEPs. What you can't do is let them continue to keep that gap widening. You've got to go in and close it. And you do that, and DIBELS is a perfect example, with data. You have to show the district, and it isn't grades. You have to stop trusting, if you're listening to this, that the grades mean anything. Get past the grades and get into the data of actual progress, right? The collection of information that proves progress. And the DIBELS is a great example of that.
Mhm.
Trust being something you just want to have to some degree, but be be suspect when you're a parent in this IEP process. Unfortunately, you have to, because
Mhm.
you have to be the one that drives progress and ensures progress is being driven with your child. All right, with
Mhm.
that, if one question really quick, can you describe phonological awareness for our listeners? Make sure they
It's
understand what that
it's
is.
the yes, it's the ability to recognize and manipulate individual sounds in words. So, It really should be introduced in pre-K, kindergarten. It's not it's phonics is when you bring in the letter. This is just manipulating a sound. So you could say, let's come up with words that rhyme with cat, bat, mat. There's little kids love this. There's games you can play, or you can get even more complicated of take the word tap and let's reverse the sounds. T, a, p, at, t. Tap becomes pat. And for dyslexics, that is inherently, it's a left hemispheric thing. That's what's hard for them. So it doesn't mean they can't do it. They just need to practice that skill with greater frequency than your neurotypical kids. Going back to just, again, data, about 60% of kids are going to learn how to read no matter what. If it's whole language, whatever, they will. That's 40% who don't. And the 20% of that, out of that 40, are the ones that really need much more intervention. They need much more, strategic intervention and diagnostic support to be able to meet the same thing as their peers. So phonological awareness, and the thing, I used to love to go into preschools and kindergarten classes because it's free. There's no materials. It's just listening, talking, playing games, taking words, spreading out the sounds. But it's a missing component in a lot of our reading programs. And then when you move into the more phonics, it's being able to understand that there's syllable types. I know one of the things I used to think would be a great question for all parents to ask their first or kindergarten and first grade teachers were, could you tell me about the syllable types? There are 6 syllable types in the English language. And I have asked that question of some educators, and they look at me like, what are you talking about? And that to me is a red flag, because that means they don't understand themselves, the foundational, issues of structured literacy. Dyslexics need rules. They need the rules. They need to be taught the rules. They have to apply the rules. They have to practice. For example, a closed syllable has a vowel sound and a consonant sound at the end. And in a closed syllable, the vowel says it's short sound. And when you teach those skills explicitly, most children can learn how to read. So that as a parent, that would be one question to ask.
Yeah.
Because to me, if a teacher doesn't know that, then maybe they haven't been, had enough professional development with understanding how to teach reading. And again, going back to look at all the reading programs we have. Why do we still have all of these kids? Because there are teachers who might not feel confident. There are teachers who might not have had the extensive training. And then there's also that issue of what happens when you've tried program A, program B, program C, and it still isn't working. You don't, throw the proverbial baby out with the bathwater. You have to go back in and say, why is this happening? What am I missing? Is this on the continuum of dyslexia a more profound case? And what does that mean? Instead of 50 times, I might need to practice it 100 times or 200 times. And I can just attest, I have worked with many students over the years, and it works if you just have patience and you have the right kind of program, and you can get students to see their progress and show them when you do this way and you practice, you get better. There's no stopping them.
Is there, what is the right type of program? Right. There's so many out there, Lindenwood Bell, Barton, there's so many more. In your mind, do any of them approach what you think is the answer?
That is a great question. I myself have been trained in Wilson. I've been trained in Orton Gillingham. I've been trained in Slingerland. And I must confess, I myself use a combination of everything. But the biggest thing is I know all of the aspects of foundational literacy. So, and I'll just share one anecdote. Many years ago, I was working with a 9th grade boy who was very angry. He was functionally illiterate. And I tried Slingerland. I tried at that time, Wilson wasn't around. I tried Orton Gillingham. And he was so angry because he felt so disenfranchised with his whole life and like he had no future. And finally, I asked him, "Is there anything you like to do?" And he said, "I like cars." And I remember I drove to a grocery store and I bought a car magazine and I went home and I developed reading lessons based on the car magazine because I knew how to do that. I pulled out all the closed syllables. I pulled out the words and we just practiced that. And that was my hook. And in 2 years, I got him reading at about a fifth grade level. So there sometimes is not a program for certain kids. But if you have someone that has that foundational background, you can teach them the rules
Yeah.
and have them
No, that's great.
practice.
So tell us a little bit about Winston Prep. What, how long is it? Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, Winston's been around for over 30 years. Scott Bazelko is our executive director. And the basic premise of Winston, our sort of tagline, is individualized education, even though we have classes and we have groups of students. But Winston groups their students based on their learning profile. So, for example, if we think about a dyslexic group of fifth and sixth graders, the wonderful thing about what we do is when they go through their day, science, math, history, literature, all of the teachers are teaching reading, even the science teacher, even the math teacher. So all of my teachers have background in foundational literacy. They know the 6-syllable types. So if they're in a science class and they're trying to decode the word endoplasmic reticulum, they know how to break it up into the pieces. They know how to help the students. And so by being in school all day long with a group of educators that are working on your skill deficits, we can close the gap much quicker. It's not a pullout. We also have a one-on-one focus program where every day students can go and get a period of time with one teacher. That's sort of where we dig into the things that are most challenging for kids. When you have a group, and if you're struggling with oral reading, you might not want to read out loud. So you might practice that with your focus teacher. And then one of the loveliest things sometimes we see is, at this time of year, we'll actually get to have some of our students, they will raise their hand in a class and offer to read out loud. And that just shows they've built their confidence, they've built their skills, and they're willing now to be an active participant in the class. And so that's our goal. So that's how we can close the gap.
No, that's a wonderful model, and I can attest that it works because of all the clients that I've had that have gone through your program and have done extremely well as a result. And I wish, and it strikes me as a doable thing for school districts, right? It's my job to do battle with them at times, but I always feel like, gosh, how do we make it better for them, right? What is the model by which they can actually drive progress and do it consistently over time and put people like me out of business? I would love that.
Well,
Truly.
I've always thought
Yeah.
that our schools are,
Yeah.
Schools for neurodiverse students shouldn't have to exist.
Yeah.
Because their needs should be able to be met. And I think, it can be political. It really comes to teacher training. I know, years ago, I worked at a school down in the Monterey Bay area, Chartwell. We had gotten a grant from the Literacy Foundation. We went into 3 elementary schools in Pacific Grove, California. One was our control, 2 others. We taught all the teachers how to use the DIBELS to do progress monitoring. For 3 years, we trained the teachers. We did workshops for families. And interestingly, the school district won a Golden Bell Award in the state of California. And 5 years later, when a new superintendent took over, they got rid of the whole program.
Insane.
And we reduced special ed referrals down to less than 4%.
Yeah. And it's all about teacher training. The idea that every teacher is trained in literacy makes perfect sense. why
Yes.
not have your science
Yeah.
teacher working on that skill? We know it takes a tremendous amount of time,
Yeah.
right?
And
If
there's
you're
an organization out in Boston called the Hansen Initiative in Language of Literacy. And I had gotten trained there to learn how to do a literacy leadership change. And it was kind of an interesting statistic that if I could get 70% of the teachers in the district to buy in, I most likely would be successful. Now, that said, there were a couple of teachers who were like, no, I'm not doing this. But we had over 70% buy in. And it was 3 years of just feeling so energized and like, wow, we are making a difference, and it didn't cost a lot of money.
no,
It was just getting people to do things differently and also recognizing that cohort of kids. So what we did is we took the kids that were in the most intensive, we gave them 45 minutes 5 days a week of additional support for reading in pullouts. The kids that needed strategic, we gave them 30 minutes 3 times a week. And the kids who were at benchmark, they were fine. And so we had these little cohorts, and then we used the DIBELS to monitor their progress. And if we had, there once in a while was that one student that was really struggling, and those might have been the referrals to special ed.
Mhm.
But it was amazing how many kids we got at benchmark by the end of each year. And we did that kindergarten through second grade.
Amazing. And with
So it's
40%,
possible.
no, it is possible. And with 40% of students being neurodiverse, it strikes me as a big enough number that we ought to be replicating that model everywhere, because it clearly works. Whoops, there you are. Anyway, final thoughts. We are running out of time. Unfortunately, we could do this all
Yeah,
day,
I
of
think
course.
final thoughts for families, just unfortunately, you really have to do your research. You can't, you have to go in and be able to say, this is what my child should be doing. What are we going to do to get them there? And you have to do you have to go and do your research, and make your case. Anywhere you can get data, you can also request an independent educational evaluation. And I would just say that anyone, if you have no measure of oral reading fluency for your child, you need to ask for it. You need to say, I need to know where they are. You can go online, it's oral reading fluency, words correct per minute. There's a chart. You can see where your child is. It's always fall, winter, spring, and you can assess that. And if your child's not meeting that critical benchmark, you can say, what are you going to do about this? How are we going to solve this problem? Because it's a piece of the puzzle that's really important.
And demand that they collect data. That's
Yes.
the key, right? And the DIBELS is a tool for that they can do every quarter to ensure that things are moving forward. And if your sense is you're being told that everything's going great and progress is being made, but you're not seeing it. One thing I'll have my clients do is video their child reading aloud,
Yes.
and bring that to your next IEP meeting. Because if that video shows a significant discrepancy in what you're hearing is happening in the classroom, that's an indication that they're not doing their jobs, right?
Mhm.
Because that oral reading, that video gives you a lot of information.
And
Of
an early intervention is really key because, in my line of work,
course,
when I get a seventh or eighth grader who's so far behind, then you've got all of the other emotional components that just make their lives that much more challenging. And so, to me, this should be a done deal by the end of grade 3. Their
yeah,
kids should be at benchmark, because if they're not, this whole idea of don't worry, they'll catch up. They don't catch up.
right.
They
No, it's
don't catch
very hard.
up.
Yes, and then, of course, all the school refusal, the
Yes,
disliking of
headaches, stomach
education,
aches.
all of it, it just all falls apart, when you can't read, and we see that again and again. Well, Kristen, I can't thank you enough for joining us. I think that was a very valuable discussion, and for those out there who are listening who have children with dyslexia, struggling in school, get into your IEP, ask for an IEP, make sure you record it, and start collecting that data you need to show the progress, right? Close that gap. That's your demand of your school district for your child. Start closing that gap. If that's not happening year after year, as a matter of law, they're failing your child, and that's you have the opportunity then to force their hand, which is what you need to do. It doesn't necessarily require an attorney, but you can, any parent can file for due process to make sure their child is making progress in school. So thank you, Kristen, again.
Thank you.
And we will, I'm sure I'll get a chance to talk to you soon. All right, everybody. Thanks for listening to Special Education Essentials. And we will see you next time. Thank you very much.
Bye.
You've been tuning in to the Special Education Essentials for Parents and Families podcast with your host, David Tollner. This podcast is not intended as legal advice and does not create an attorney-client relationship. Please talk to your legal counsel about your own situation. You can find this show on all the major platforms, including YouTube, LinkedIn, Facebook, Apple Podcast, Spotify, and on our website, tollnerlawoffices.com. Thank you for your positive reviews, comments, questions, and for sharing this show with others.